So the first story is about a Korean woman right after the Korean War who gave birth in Korea to a mixed-race baby. The father was an American soldier who went home after the war, and here she is left with this child who was a mixed-race child, and which is a very problematic thing in Korea, which at that time was very discriminatory against mixed-race children. And this child it didn't look like the other Korean kids. Her hair was a little curly, and she was, it was a little light in color and so forth, so she kind of stood out. Now, a lot of people who gave birth to mixed-race couples after the Korean War actually killed their babies because the shame and the harassment that they experienced was so severe and so horrible that they would just kill their children. But this woman couldn't bring herself to do that. She loved this baby, and she raised that child as best she could. For 7 years, she raised that child. But you know what? The shame and the humiliation and the taunting that she experienced over that 7 years just got worse and worse and worse. And so finally, when that little girl was 7, that mother did something that I'm telling you, you and I cannot imagine. We cannot even fathom. She abandoned that 7-year-old child to the streets. Now, I've got a granddaughter who's 7 years old. I cannot imagine abandoning that child and letting her try to fend for herself in the world. It's unbelievable. It's unfathomable. And this child was not alone. There were gangs almost of these little children who were living on the streets. They'd sleep in caves or in bombed-out buildings or under bridges, and they would eat mice that they would catch and locusts, and they would steal fruit from the fields of the farmers, and they would eat grass. And the people who would harass them, the rest of culture would harass them and use the ugliest word in the Korean language, which is a word that means alien devil. I mean, you can't say anything worse in that culture than this word that meant alien devil. And so it didn't take long for this little girl to begin to draw some conclusions about herself as she tried to survive on these streets. This is what she said years later. She said, when you hear what you are when you're a little child day after day, you begin to believe that about yourself. I believe that anyone could do whatever they wanted to me physically because I wasn't a person. I was inhuman. I was dirty. I was unclean. I had no name. She didn't know her name. I had no identity. I had no family. I had no future. And I hated myself. Can you imagine? Little precious child. That's her self-identity based on the abuse that she suffered being abandoned on the streets. So 2 years went by that she lived on the streets. You can imagine the winters are very cold in Korea. And she told me how they used to go into foxholes and take straw and shiver and try to live in these foxholes when it got really cold outside. So for 2 years she did this. And then finally, she got so sick. She got cholera, and they thought she was dead. She was laying in a pile on a trash heap. And they figured she was dead, but they realized, wait a minute, she's not quite dead. And so a compassionate nurse took her to this new orphanage that was just built. Now, it was a very primitive orphanage. It was not anything, it wasn't much, but at least it was a bit of a home. And so she brought this girl to the home, and she was one of the oldest children at the home. And that's where she began to live. Now, one day, the word came that an American couple was going to come the next day to the orphanage and was going to adopt a baby boy. And so that was all exciting for everybody at the orphanage because, hey, somebody's going to have a chance. Somebody's going to have a life. Somebody's going to have an opportunity and a future and a hope. And so her job as one of the oldest was to spruce up all the baby boys so they looked good. So she would give them baths and try to get decent clothes on them and comb their hair and so forth. And the next day, the American couple came. And here's what she said about them. She said it was like Goliath had come back to life. I saw that man with his huge hands lift up every baby, and I knew he loved every one of them as if they were his own. I saw tears running down his face, and I knew if they could, they would take the whole lot home with them. Then she said, he saw me out of the corner of his eye. Now listen to her description of herself. Now let me tell you, I was 9 years old then, and I didn't even weigh 30 pounds. I was a scrawny thing. I had worms in my body. I had lice in my hair. I had boils all over me. I was full of scars. I was not a pretty sight. But that man came over to me. And he rattled away something in English, and I looked up at him. And then he took this huge hand of his, and he laid it on the side of my face. What was he saying? He was saying, this is the child that I want. And as that woman was telling me her story, what came into my mind is that snapshot is a picture of the Jesus that I know. Because the Jesus that I know looks beyond the scars and beyond the filth and beyond the sin and beyond the failings that we have. And he looks beyond that deep into a soul that's made in the image of God. And he wants to look in your eyes. And he wants to say, this is the child that I want. This is the child that I want to adopt. I mean, if you're like me, you look around, you come to church on a Sunday, you see people kind of dressed up and spruced up, and you think, if they knew all about me, if they knew all my secrets, if they knew all my fantasies, if they knew the clandestine transgressions that I engage in and so, I'd be as rejected as that little girl in Korea. But the amazing thing about Jesus is that he sees the total picture. He sees the real you, and yet, despite that, he says, this is a child who I want to adopt. Because he sees us differently. He sees us through heaven's eyes. There's a song called In Heaven's Eyes by a guy named Phil McHugh, and the chorus goes like this. It says, in heaven's eyes, there are no losers. In heaven's eyes, there is no hopeless cause. There's only people like you with feelings like me, amazed by the grace we can find in heaven's eyes. And because of that love and because of that grace, Jesus wants to adopt you as his child. That's the first thing that I would say to someone if they ask me about the Jesus that I know.